We made another video about the Rwandan genocide that we could not release on YouTube due to demonetization and age restriction guidelines. Watch this video and 150 other exclusives hosted on our website armchairhistory.tv, linked below with a discount. After the fall of Somalia's brutal Cold War-era dictator in 1991, the East African country plunged into a devastating civil war. Militant organizations vied for power, and for years, the country lacked a functioning federal government. In this chaos, the United Nations sought to alleviate some of the poverty and starvation that came with the war, delivering food and other humanitarian aid. However, these shipments were violently intercepted by militia forces, undermining UN efforts. These groups soon took their attacks to UN peacekeeping forces, including an attack on an inspection checkpoint which killed 25 Pakistani troops in a single day. This served as a precedent for Operation Gothic Serpent, a US-led effort to track down and capture the leader of the most powerful Somali militia, Mohammed Farah Aidid, and end this chaos for good. Brigadier General William Garrison had spent weeks gathering intel to find Aidid, who led the Somali National Alliance and effectively controlled the capital of Mogadishu. By October 1993, a local informer discovered that two members of Aidid's inner circle were meeting near the Olympic Hotel in the Bakara Market District. This southern area of the city was considered hostile territory, so a plan was drawn up to capture these two figures in a quick and decisive action that would take no more than an hour. The men equipped with this task were the best men the Army had to offer, made up of the 75th Ranger Regiment and the officially non-existent Delta Force, with the mission requiring no more than 160 men. They would enter the city in 8 Little Birds, 3 Kiowas, a spy plane, and of course, 8 MH-60 Blackhawks, codenamed Super 61 through 8, each one carrying a squad of Rangers and Delta, colloquially called D-Boys, to the target location. Meanwhile, General Garrison would maintain an overwatch of the entire operation from base. When the rotors started and the birds lifted off, the code word Irene was transmitted over the radio. The mission was a go. The Rangers and D-Boys were going to Mogadishu. The Rangers' primary task was to provide security around the target building as Delta made a sweep inside. Once they apprehended the targets, they would be loaded onto a convoy of Humvees back to base. Known as chalks, small groups of soldiers would also rappel out of helicopters, roping down on each corner of the building. While the first 3 chalks progressed smoothly, Chalk 4 was deployed a block away due to a misunderstanding. Nevertheless, as the Black Hawk hovered over more than 60 feet above, the Rangers began hitting the ground. In what would be considered a metaphor for the mission to come, the 18-year-old Private First Class Todd Blackburn, in a rush of adrenaline, jumped and missed the rope entirely, falling to the earth on his back. It was the first of a number of embarrassing casualties, but one in which Blackburn would ultimately survive. Meanwhile, as the other 3 squads roped down to secure the perimeter of the target building, crowds of residents marched in from every visible entrance. Somali militia were found on rooftops, in windows, and in between buildings, all prepared to hamper the Americans. Local vitriol against the US and UN forces also worsened, as many of these locals had suffered through past raids from American forces against militia leaders, missions which inadvertently targeted civilians and clan leaders. One example of this was the Bloody Monday raid in July 1993, where a villa hosting tribal elders was attacked by UN forces during their hunt for Aidid. A big thanks to today's video sponsor, Bespoke Post, a monthly membership club that delivers curated boxes of top-notch goods tailored to your interests and passions right to your door. Whether you're a seasoned adventurer, a home chef, or a style enthusiast, Bespoke Post has something for everyone. 90% of Bespoke Post's products come from small up-and-coming brands, many based here in the US. And each month, members are introduced to cool new products based on a preference quiz they fill out. I recently received the Nomad Box, a set of packing cubes made from durable ripstop nylon and mesh to let your packed items breathe, and perfect for maximizing the space in my luggage for travel or vacationing. And I also received the Antipasti Box, which includes a beautiful acacia charcuterie board and 3-piece cheese knife set, cured meats, and maple onion jam, ideal for parties and entertaining friends. Bespoke Post is also offering a membership program where you can get great deals like 30% off or more all year round, and it's totally free to join. You also get a customized selection of hand-picked products that you can preview before it ships. Decide if you'd like to keep it or swap out the products, or just skip the month entirely for no charge. You only pay for what you want. Support our channel and get 20% off your first Bespoke Post membership purchase by clicking the link in the description and entering code ARMCHAIR20 at checkout, or visit bespokepost.com/armchair20. What Somalia would later call the Day of the Rangers began with a torrent of gunfire unleashed at US forces from all sides. Immediately, Rangers were forced into cover and began a firefight that would last longer than the mission initially demanded. Somali militia were well armed, sporting Kalashnikov rifles, shoulder-mounted rockets, and heavy machine guns bolted to the bed of Toyota pickup trucks. Private Blackburn was escorted out of the city by a 3 Humvee detachment led by Sergeant Jeff Struker. Heading north and west out of the target area, the Humvees navigated through the dense urban landscape, surrounded by armed Somali fighters. The convoy quickly turned into a combat-driven escape. During this mad dash, Sergeant Dominic Pilla was killed while manning the 50 cal machine gun atop one of the Humvees. It was the first US fatality in the battle. Meanwhile, Delta Force was making short work of the target building. Aside from a few hiccups, the mission was proceeding smoothly. Having completed their task, the D-Boys loaded their prisoners into the main convoy. Chalk 4 continued to defend their inopportune position while Super 6-1 provided air support. It was only at this moment when a militiaman on top of a roof, directly behind Super 6-1, fired an RPG round into the tail rotor of the Black Hawk, immediately sending it into a tailspin. A frenzy of radio chatter erupted with this final transmission from pilot Elvis Wolcott. 6-1 going down. The Black Hawk clipped a rooftop and landed on its left side, killing both Wolcott and co-pilot Bull Briley. Adid's strategy was paying off, having employed carefully thought-out guerrilla tactics he had studied in Moscow. During this time, the war between the USSR and the Mujahideen was ongoing, and Afghan insurgents had made extensive use of shoulder-fired anti-air missiles. This tactic, combined with the sheer numbers Adid fielded, allowed a form of unconventional warfare that US Special Forces would be unequipped to handle. As Chalk 2 watched the smoke plume from several blocks away, horror quickly gave way to action. The squad split in two, with half traversing the crash site on foot, leaving their pre-assigned perimeter and entering the maelstrom. Staff Sergeant Daniel Bush and Sergeant Jim Smith emerged from the wreckage of Super 6-1 to provide defensive fire. A Little Bird landed at the crash site, and Chief Warrant Officer Keith Jones came out to support the survivors. Chalk 2 also showed up around the same time. Bush had been killed defending the position, but Smith escaped aboard the Little Bird with Jones and the body of his comrade. Chalk 2 stayed with the two remaining survivors, as their injuries required medical attention before proper evacuation. The remaining Humvee convoy picked up the rest of Chalk 4, turning into the crash site. However, due to the disorientating environment, the lead driver made a wrong turn and went south, away from the crash site. Meanwhile, Chalks 1 and 3 were ordered to move on the crash site on foot. Delta and the Rangers proceeded to charge through 6 city blocks of lead and dust, with the advance seeing Sergeant First Class Earl Robert Fillmore killed in action. The Blackhawks Super 6-4 and 8 were ordered to leave their position and assist in the rescue. 8 arrived at the crash site, with its squad rappelling down to help those on the ground. During this procedure, the chopper took a direct hit from an RPG round, but the Blackhawks pilots managed to hold the bird steady until every man was aground. American forces weren't in the clear yet, however. The main Humvee convoy was still lost, and Somali militants began placing roadblocks around the city. Super 6-4 attempted to provide support to the lost Humvees, but was struck by an RPG round and tried retreating back to base. At that moment, the chopper's rotor suddenly fell into a tailspin. Through sheer determination, the pilots managed to land the chopper on its feet in a nearby neighborhood on the other side of National Street. Nearby, Super 6-2 flew overhead, spotting a mob approaching the downed bird. Delta operators Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart aboard the Super 6-2 offered to deploy down to defend them, and after some argument, their request was approved. They were quickly deployed by Super 6-2 and moved the injured pilot Michael Durant to a tree, preparing for a chaotic defense. The remaining Black Hawk overhead continued to provide minigun support, while snipers on a nearby Little Bird gave additional fire. Further support requests were also made by 6-2, but were denied. The hovering Black Hawk was then hit by an RPG on the side and was forced to make a stumbling retreat back to base. On the ground, Gordon was killed inside the wreckage, and Shugart brought his CAR-15 to Durant to use to defend himself for at least the duration of the rifle's magazine. Shugart soon after ran out of ammo and was killed, along with the remaining crew inside. After enduring an hour of combat, Michael Durant remained by the tree as the jeers of Somali irregulars filled the air. His situation seemed hopeless. His rescuers were either dying or dead, and the surrounding Somali locals, spurred by SNA militants, swarmed the wreckage, assaulting Durant brutally. Moments later, a militia officer intervened, firing his Kalashnikov into the air to disperse the crowd, and taking Durant prisoner in the name of Mohammed Farah ID. The bodies of Gordon and Shughart, as well as Bill Cleveland, Tommy Field, and Ray Frank were retrieved by the Mogadishu locals. From here, their bodies were stripped, tied up, and dragged through the city. Mutilated and severed into pieces, much of this ritual was documented and presented on American news stations just days afterwards. After more than a week and a half in captivity, U.S. Ambassador to Somalia, Robert Oakley, managed to negotiate for the release of Michael Durant, along with what remained of the bodies of the 5 American soldiers who died at Super 6-4. Throughout the 15-hour battle in Mogadishu, the ferocity of combat became mired in atrocities committed on both sides. As Somali irregulars initially swarmed the target building using human shields, U.S. Army Rangers attempted precise shots to avoid harming civilians. However, as the battle intensified around the crash site of Super 6-4, desperation overcame caution, leading Rangers to fire indiscriminately, even against militia using human shields. Among these Somali casualties, many civilians were tragically caught in the crossfire. The lost Humvee convoy suffered heavy casualties, with 50% of its members wounded or killed. Chalk 2 incurred injuries while defending Crash Site 1, and Chalks 1 and 3 sustained injuries attempting to reach the same location. What was expected to be a 30-minute mission had escalated into 2 grueling hours of intense combat. Strucker's convoy, now combat ineffective, began heading back to base. A United Nations Quick Response Force tried to get into the city, but was overwhelmed and retreated. Chalks 1 and 3 arrived at the Marahan Road and occupied some buildings, but were similarly combat ineffective due to casualties. Among them, Corporal Jamie Smith bled out overnight. Delta and Rangers were forced into nighttime firefights, with resupplies by helicopters preventing ammo shortages. General Garrison called for UN peacekeepers at the South Port for aid. After multiple hours, a UN convoy of soldiers, APCs, and tanks left the port well past 11 p.m. En route, multiple vehicles were disabled by Mogadishu locals. The driver of the lead Malaysian APC, Corporal Mat Aznan Awang, was killed when an RPG hit his front dashboard. While taking this route, 7 more Malaysians and 2 Pakistanis were wounded. Throughout the dawn, the Delta and Rangers at Crash Site 1 were besieged and were waiting for the rescue convoy. The head of the convoy turned onto National Road, hit a roadblock, and partially dismounted to clear it on foot. Rescue forces arrived at Crash Site 2 and saw what they dreaded most. The Black Hawk was empty of US forces, alive or dead. Somali irregulars had paraded the bodies of Gordon, Sugar, and the 6-4 crew through the streets. Devastated, and without further tasks, the rescue forces detonated the helicopter to prevent enemy capture. With the roadblock clear, the convoy continued and headed east to the besieged Chalks 1 and 3, as well as to Crash Site 1. The vehicles surrounded the crash site and provided support and rescue, with Americans and Malaysians fighting into dawn, supported by Pakistani tanks. By 5:45 a.m., the survivors of Crash Site 1 were rescued and the convoy headed to Mogadishu Stadium. However, there wasn't enough room in the vehicles for the uninjured Delta and Rangers in Chalks 1 and 3. These men were forced to make a frantic escape on foot through the city in what would become known as the Mogadishu Mile. They moved west and south to National Street, where they planned to rendezvous with the remainder of the convoy. After charging through several city blocks in a hail of gunfire, the last few US troops in the combat zone reached a contingent of the UN convoy heading for the Pakistani-controlled stadium. And just like that, the battle was over. 18 Allied soldiers were killed in the mission, and dozens more wounded, making it the deadliest battle the US had experienced since the Vietnam War. The estimates for Somali casualties range in the hundreds. General Garrison and Secretary of Defense Les Aspin took blame for the disastrous operation, with the latter resigning by the end of the year. Just days later, President Clinton ordered a general withdrawal from the region, which was completed in March 1994. Remember to check out our exclusive video on the Rwandan genocide on armchairhistory.tv. Your support keeps our channel going.